Baseball. It's a favorite sport for many people, far and wide, myself included. It is hailed by many as the sport where truly anything can happen, where nothing is impossible until all 27 outs have been recorded. The tale I am about to tell is a perfect example of this, with unlikely circumstances begetting unlikely circumstances, with small market teams standing up to giants, and with help coming at times from the most unlikely of places. This is the story of the race for the third and final 2025 National League Wild Card position. The New York Mets came into 2025 like a team possessed. They had made some major signings in the offseason, re-signing Pete Alonso for a 2-year, $54 million contract with an opt-out after 2025. Signing pitcher Clay Holmes to a 3-year, $38 million contract, not to mention an absolutely earth-shattering contract with outfielder Juan Soto, totaling $765 million over 15 years. The largest contract in professional sports history at the time of this video. And it didn't take long for Soto to show why the Mets had taken such a large gamble on him. As a matter of fact, it only took until Game 2.
Well, he's left-handed, and he hits this one with authority. That one is out of here.
And the Mets didn't stop there. With electrifying walk-offs from both Francisco Lindor
That should do it. Upper deck. It's gone.
and Starling Marte
This one into center field. Base hit. Here comes Alonso. Stevenson's thrown the plate. Too late, and the Mets have won it.
at Citi Field in the earliest days of the season. At the end of play on June 12, the Mets boasted a record of 45 and 24, the best record in Major League Baseball at that point in the season. They were a rather comfortable 5.5 games ahead of second place in the NL East at the time, the Philadelphia Phillies. It seemed no one could step up to the challenge posed by the New York Mets. Oftentimes, it is extremely difficult to pinpoint exactly when a downfall begins. But in the case of the 2025 New York Mets, I can tell you with precision when that turning point was. And it came in the top of the 6th inning at Citi Field on June 13th at the hands of an unlikely source, the Tampa Bay Rays. The Rays were going through their own struggles at the time, being forced to play their home games at the Yankees spring training facility at George M. Steinbrenner Field due to Hurricane Milton destroying their typical home at Tropicana Field in October of 2024. The Rays were simply trying to make the best of a bad situation, but when they came to Citi Field, it seemed that they too were no match for the apparently all-powerful Mets. By the top of the 6th inning, the Mets had built a formidable 5-1 lead. But with one out and the bases loaded, Rays outfielder Jake Mangum would change the course of history with one swing off of Paul Blackburn.
That's up the middle. Rays are coming back. Lau is in. Diaz is in. Aranda to third. Mangum makes it a 5-3 Mets lead.
But the Rays weren't done. The Mets quickly pulled Blackburn in favor of Max Kranick in order to face Rays shortstop Jose Caballero. However, on a 2-2 count against Caballero, Kranick wouldn't fare much better.
About twice will be the batter here.
It's a slow grounder. We'll get a run in. Caballero close at first, but he's out. The Rays, though, have made it a one-run game.
The Rays had now made it a 1-run ball game, and they still were not finished. With 2 gone now, and a man on second, Rays outfielder Cameron Meisner stepped up to the plate.
Macleod at second for Cameron Maestro.
To left field, might tie the game. Here comes Mangum, and the Rays have come all the way back. It's 5-5.
Yet another hit had been given up by Kranick, bringing home the tying run. Now at this point, you might be forgiven for thinking the Mets still had a chance to escape this jam with a tie game. But catcher Danny Jansen had other plans.
Jansen, number 9 batter.
Jansen gets into one. Deep to left field. Nimmo to the wall. Gone!
The score would go unchanged for the remainder of the game. But at this point, you may still be wondering, How could this game in the middle of June be so instrumental to the downfall of the 2025 Mets? Well, it wouldn't be the Mets' only loss to Tampa Bay.
The Mets are down to their final out. Line drive toward the middle and a hop, no snared by Walls. He'll take his time, flip to first, and the Rays win again in New York. Swing and a pop-up in a left field should end it. Mangum drifting back toward the line, waiting.
The Mets would go on to concede a 3-game sweep to the Rays despite home field advantage, and when traveling to division rival Atlanta's ballpark, would give up a second consecutive sweep. But at this point, the Mets were still tied with Philadelphia for first place in the NL East. Even this, however, was not a safe position. After losing 6 in a row against Tampa Bay and Atlanta, the Mets had to go to Philadelphia's Citizens Bank Park to battle the Phillies for control over the division in a 3-game series. In Game 1, the Phillies struck first, quickly establishing a 2-0 lead in the 4th inning. The Mets then bit back, launching back-to-back home runs in the 6th to make it a brand new ballgame. The Phillies would not accept this so easily, however, and had a 6-run 7th and a 2-run 8th to bring us to the final score of 10-2 in favor of the Phillies. Game 1 had been lost, capping off a 7-game losing streak, and the Mets were now a game back of the division lead. But there were still 2 games to play in the series, and all hope was not yet lost, as the Mets would even win Game 2 11-4 to tie the Phillies again. However, the Phillies would once again annihilate the Mets the next day for a 7-1 final in Game 3. The Phillies had asserted their dominance over the National League East, of which the 2025 Mets would never again take control. But they were still firmly holding on to the top wildcard spot in the National League. Surely that would never be forfeited, right? In the last days before the 2025 All-Star Game in Atlanta, the Cincinnati Reds beat the Colorado Rockies 4-2, securing a series win and bringing their overall record to 50-47. On October 4th of the previous year, the Reds had named Terry Tito Francona as their manager, announcing a 3-year contract. Francona was known for turning teams around after down years, having brought every team he had taken over to that point, with the exception of the Philadelphia Phillies in 1997, to the postseason in his first year as manager. He even won the 2004 World Series with the Boston Red Sox, ending the infamous Curse of the Bambino. The Reds were also coming off a down year. They had finished 2024 with a losing record of 77-85, and were just hoping to have a winning record with Francona in 2025. No one had particularly high expectations. At the All-Star break, Cincinnati was 4th place in the NL Central. Only the Pittsburgh Pirates were below them. Now, following the All-Star break, it was time for the Mets and Reds to meet for the first time in 2025. On July 18th, fans poured into Citi Field, 42,390 strong, to watch the Mets take on the seemingly insignificant Reds. The Reds would then stun the Mets, beating them 8-4 and 5-2 in the first 2 games of the series, before finally conceding a game on July 20th, losing 3-2 to the Mets. At this point, the 3 NL wildcard spots were held by the Cubs, Mets, and Padres, with the Reds 2.5 games behind San Diego for the final spot. At this point, you would still be forgiven for thinking this Mets-Reds series would be completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. But it wasn't. Fast forward to September 5th. It was time for the Reds and the Mets to meet once again for another 3-game series, this time at Cincinnati's Great American Ballpark. By now, the Phillies were a comfortable 6 games ahead of the Mets for control over the NL East. However, the Mets firmly held onto a wild card position, albeit now the 3rd and final spot, 4 games ahead of the closest threat, the San Francisco Giants. The Reds were an additional game back of the Giants. The Mets would defeat the Reds 5-4 in Game 1 of the 3-game set on September 5th, and now had a chance to tie and then take control of the season series between the two over the next 2 days. However, this would not come to be. The Reds bested the Mets 6-3 in Game 2, taking a 2-0 lead in the second inning and never once relinquishing the lead after that. The Mets could only hope now to tie the season series in Game 3.
First pitch, swung on and crushed deep to right field. Marte going back, he'll turn and just watch this one fly.
The Mets would strike first in Game 3, thanks to a solo shot by Brett Beatty in the third inning. The Reds would tie the game 1-1 in the fourth, and in the fifth,
Ellie struck out looking. He's grounded out to first base.
Drives that to right center. That's down again to the wall. Marte roared for third. Wave is on. Throw home. De La Cruz to third. Marte scores. And first line to third. Reds take the lead. Double RBI and alert grab of the bag at third base. It's 2-1 Reds with a man 90 feet.
would take control. There's no other way to put it, as Reds star shortstop Ellie De La Cruz would hammer a ball to right center, which would roll all the way to the wall. Noelvi Marte, who was on first at the time, dashed all the way home, allowing De La Cruz to make it to third for a triple.
Hayes has been a run producer. Ribbies in 42 of his 91 games as a Red.
Grounded to third by Beatty. Base hit. De La Cruz scores. Hayes delivers again.
The Reds would then extend their lead to 3-1 before Juan Soto hit a solo home run in the top of the ninth, allowing the Mets to threaten to tie the game. Later in the frame, however, with Mets on first and second, Starling Marte would ground into a quick double play to end the game, which would need to be seen to be believed.
Sadi on home, swinging a broken bat, one hopper up the middle. Ellie scoops to Macleod, one. Got a double play. That's what I'm talking about.
With a final score of 3-2 in favor of the Reds, Cincy had taken control of the season series. No one else stood between the Reds and Mets in the wildcard race now, but at the end of play on September 7th, the Mets were still 4 games ahead. However, these 2 wins for Cincinnati would be the beginning of yet another colossal losing streak for the Mets, who conceded 8 in a row to the combined efforts of the Reds, Phillies, who only widened the already impossible gap for the division lead even further, and the Texas Rangers. Now, the Reds smell blood. The end of play on September 13th, the Mets had lost their 8th game in a row. The Reds were now just a game and a half behind them for the final wild-card spot. They wouldn't even need to surpass the Mets for the final spot, only to tie them. They had the head-to-head tiebreaker. Going into the last 2 series of the regular season, these 2 teams were now neck and neck, tied for the final spot, although technically the Reds were in control. Coming off a 5-game win streak, including a 4-game sweep of their division rivals, the Chicago Cubs, the Reds seemed like they had a real shot to do the impossible. But then, disaster struck. The Reds lost the first 2 games of a 3-game set to their long-standing rivals, the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Reds were now a game behind, and worse yet, the Arizona Diamondbacks had caught them as well. To many, the challenge posed by these circumstances seemed insurmountable. The Reds had surely run out of time. However, as history will tell, the victor is not victorious if the vanquished does not consider himself so. Going into Game 3 against the Pirates, the Reds were still far from giving up. The Reds took a 2-0 lead in the bottom of the 5th, and the Pirates brought themselves back within a run in the top of the 8th. However, in the top of the 9th, the Pirates threatened once again. With 1 out, Brian Reynolds launched a ball into the outfield that was sure to go over the wall, that was sure to tie the game. Noelvi Marte had other plans.
He swings. High fly right field. Marte all the way back. Leaps at the wall. He caught it!
Dubbed by many as the catch that saved the season, Marte's robbery secured a Reds victory, keeping them within a game of the Mets with just 1 series remaining in the regular season for each of them, each visiting a division rival. While the Mets needed only to deal with the Miami Marlins, who were 5 games under 500 going into the last series of the year, and had already been eliminated from playoff contention long ago, the Reds faced a much greater challenge, the Milwaukee Brewers, who boasted the best regular season of the year at 96-63 going into Game 160. The odds once again seemed stacked against Cincy. But once again, Cincy had by no means considered themselves out of the running. In the bottom of the third inning, with a man on second, Bryce Terang hit a single into center field, allowing the Brewers to strike first and take a 1-0 lead. However, this would be Milwaukee's only run of the day. Only one frame later, in the top of the fourth, the Reds would tie the game as Spencer Steer knocked his own single past the diving shortstop with runners at the corners. Miguel Andujar would launch his own base hit into the outfield in the top of the sixth, bringing home Gavin Lux, who was on third, to give the Reds a 2-1 lead. The Reds would emerge victorious in Game 160 with a 3-1 final. Then, it was the Mets' turn, and it wouldn't take long for them to assert themselves.
And he drives one to deep right center field. Back goes Conine near the wall, and it's out of here! Lindor opens another game with a home run. This time on the game's second pitch. His 11th leadoff home run of the season, 31 on the year.
Francisco Lindor quickly hit a leadoff homer on the second pitch of the game, giving the Mets an early 1-0 lead. Pete Alonso would then roll a ball down the third baseline, which would bring in Juan Soto from second. The Mets were up 2-0 before 3 outs had even been recorded. The Marlins, however, would answer in kind, when in the bottom of the fifth, with runners at the corners, Heriberto Hernandez would launch one down the first baseline, which landed fair in the corner, giving Hernandez a bases-clearing triple. The Marlins had tied the game at 2 apiece, and they weren't finished yet. With Hernandez still at third, Jacob Marcy grounded to first, but due to an error by Pete Alonso, the Mets' only play would be at first, allowing Hernandez to score and giving the Marlins a 3-2 lead. The bottom of the fifth would be capped off by pinch hitter Connor Norby unleashing a 2-run blast to the left to make it 6-2 Marlins, which would be the final. The Mets once again have the same record as the Reds, who held the tiebreaker over them. Game 161 was now a must-win. The Reds would once again play first and inflict a second consecutive defeat on now the best team in baseball with a 7-4 final. The Mets would almost certainly be doomed if they could not best the Marlins later that day. The Mets would achieve this, defeating Miami 5-0. The entire season for the Mets and the Reds would come down to Game 162. The Reds would open things in the top of the second with a solo homer by Ellie De La Cruz to give Cincinnati an early lead, and by the bottom of the fourth, the Reds were leading 2-1. But Brewers catcher Danny Jansen, an acquisition from the trade deadline, would launch one of his own, a 2-run shot this time, to give Milwaukee a 3-2 lead. The Reds would try valiantly to reclaim the game, but ultimately fail, finally suffering a loss to Milwaukee with a 4-2 final. As this final was posted at Lone Depot Park, but the Mets were currently playing the Marlins one final time, the Mets knew that all they had to do was win this one game, and they would be in the postseason. All the troubles of the last few months would be wiped away, as they would get to face the Los Angeles Dodgers in the National League wildcard. If they lost, however, their season would be over. In the bottom of the fourth, the Marlins would unleash a 4-run onslaught against the Mets, taking a decisive 4-0 lead in just one frame. The Mets would try hard to come back, but eventually it came down to the top of the ninth. 3 outs, 1 final chance. With a man on first and 1 out, the Mets reached the top of the order in Francisco Lindor as he stepped to the plate. With an 0-1 count and the season on the line, Lindor grounded to first and, well, you know what? I'll just let the fine gentleman over at SNY break it down for you.
Corner. And now Lindor been on base 3 times today, a double and 2 long. And he pulls one on the ground, a chance for 2 to second, 1 back to first. And the Mets' agonizing 3.5-month slow motion collapse is complete. It is unfathomable that this collection of talent winds up outside of an expanded playoff system after having the best record in baseball for the first 2.5 months of the season. Everything goes wrong over the last 3.5 months, and the Mets find themselves on the outside looking in.
I think a lot of the players felt as though this day would never come, that they'd be able to turn it on at some point and not have to endure this, but they weren't able to do that.
Well, you got a Marlins team 2007, 2008. We don't have to remind Met fans that have done this. They took 2 out of 3 here. The Mets took the series. They're in. They didn't do it.
The Mets had had their postseason hopes snatched away from them by a sub-500 Miami on a game-ending, season-ending double play. The Reds, watching from the visiting clubhouse of American Family Field, began the jubilant celebration. Cigars were smoked, champagne was sprayed by the gallon, and Terry Francona gave a rousing speech to his overjoyed team. Even the Reds' division rival Brewers, who had just beaten the Reds in Game 162, issued a congratulation of their own by displaying the Reds' postseason clinching on American Family Field's video board, which the Reds then posed in front of. Even the Marlins, who had still finished the season under 500, couldn't help but take pride in their hand in all this, posing for a photo in front of their own dugout, much to the outrage of Mets fans everywhere.
I'm watching the Marlins. They just took a team picture in front of their dugout like they're going to the postseason.
Well, this was their World Series. Yep, they took 2 out of 3, knocked the Mets out of the postseason. We saw the Reds celebrating in Milwaukee.
Once the dust had settled from Game 162, life went on for the two teams of this back-and-forth battle. The Reds would be swept in 2 games in the National League Wild Card Series by the eventual World Series champion Dodgers at Dodger Stadium, to the surprise of almost no one. But the Reds didn't seem particularly upset by this. They had already achieved so much more than they had ever set out to do at the start of the 2025 campaign. The Mets, on the other hand, with one of the highest payrolls in baseball, needed to do some serious reevaluation and make some changes after their catastrophic collapse. Most notably, they allowed Pete Alonso to walk in free agency, traded utility Jeff McNeil to the Athletics in exchange for minor league pitcher Yordan Rodriguez, signed Jorge Polanco to a 2-year, $40 million deal, and acquired infielder Marcus Semien from the Texas Rangers in exchange for outfielder Brandon Nimmo and cash considerations. So, what is the moral of this tale of miracle after miracle, of unlikely event after unlikely event, of a metaphorical David, time after time, stepping up to Goliath? Is it never give up? Or is it never underestimate your opponent? Or perhaps it might even be money can't buy victory? No. The lesson here, dear audience, is things could always be worse. Be glad you're not the New York Mets. Thank you for watching.